Hello everyone, my name is Tamara and I wrote my master's thesis last year at Tel Aviv University in cooperation with the University of Landau in the field of peace psychology. Unfortunately, I cannot be here tonight, which is why I present my main results in this short video. So, the title of my project was Abstract or Concrete, the different preferences for representations of historical transgressions between victim and perpetrator groups. Before I start, I want to thank the Forum für Friedenspsychologie for the small grant that I won for this project and that helped me to recruit more participants. So due to the short time today, I won't go into too much detail and only present the most important facts to understand my research. So the whole project built on the one hand on the needs-based model of reconciliation, which suggests that victim and perpetrator groups experience a threat to different dimensions of their social identities, which in turn translates into different needs. The need for acknowledgement of the victim group's suffering or for forgiveness for the perpetrator's wrongdoings. On the other hand, we have construal level theory, which briefly summarized describes the relationship between psychological distance, like temporal, spatial, social, or even hypothetical distance of an object or event, with mental construals, which is the extent to which we think in an abstract or concrete way. The level of abstraction increases with increasing psychological distance. If we combine those two, research shows that members of victim and perpetrator groups construe historical transgressions in different ways, which can cause intergroup misunderstandings and hinder reconciliation efforts. The aim of the present research was to examine a new dimension of those construals, whether members of victim and perpetrator groups prefer abstract or concrete representations of the events, and whether these preferences influence the willingness to reconcile. It is hypothesized that, on the one hand, members of perpetrator groups prefer using abstract representations of the transgression, increasing the psychological distance from the events in order to satisfy the need to restore their moral social identity. On the other hand, members of victim groups prefer concrete representations that bring the historic transgressions psychologically closer to the here and now and thus underscore the perpetrator group members' moral depth and in order to satisfy the need to restore their agentic identity. This slide gives you an overview of the 3 studies that we conducted between April 2020 and February of this year. We chose the Holocaust as the historical transgression, and therefore we recruited Jewish Israelis and Germans as participants, representing the historical victim and perpetrator groups. The first study, which also functioned as a pilot study to test the material, aimed to answer the basic question whether members of perpetrator groups, in this case Germans, prefer more abstract representations of the Holocaust when being in contact with members of the victim group, Jews in this case. And the other way around, of course, if members of the victim group prefer concrete representations, which brings the event psychologically closer and kind of reminds the perpetrator group of their wrongdoing. In study 2, we aim to investigate whether this effect is unique to the victim-perpetrator dyad, such that the effect can be observed for the transgressive context of those of the chosen groups, but not for alternative negative and neutral contexts. And in study 3, we wanted to see whether the chosen representation used in intergroup dialogue has an effect on the willingness to reconcile. In the case of our example, we can also talk about an effect on the positive attitude towards the other group and not necessarily the willingness to reconcile, because it's maybe not that fitting in the German-Jewish context. Instead of describing the method and procedure in detail, I will only show you a few examples of the stimuli that we used and which we pre-tested in the first study for being perceived as concrete and abstract. Pictures count as concrete and written text as abstract. Okay, now we come to the results already of the first study. This one could confirm the basic hypothesis that members of perpetrator groups, in this case Germans, prefer more abstract representations of the Holocaust when being in contact with members of the victim group, Jews, and it can be assumed that this is linked to their need to restore their moral social identity, and they don't want to specifically remind the victim group of their crimes. Jews, on the other hand, prefer more concrete representations, which could stem from an attempt to direct their need for recognition and agency towards the perpetrators. In study 2, we tried to replicate the effect in the Holocaust condition, and we added 2 different contexts. And we could indeed show that the effect was again strongest in the Holocaust context, weaker in the alternative negative context, which was the Rwandan genocide, and reversed in the neutral context. And those findings indicate that at least the strength of the effect is unique to the victim-perpetrator dyad. Furthermore, I want to present a few exploratory results, namely Jews have a higher need for agency than Germans. We could show that. Germans have, on the other hand, a higher need for communion than Jews. Furthermore, regarding psychological distance, Germans prefer the Holocaust to be presented as a more distant event than Jews. And the more right the political orientation of the German participants was, the greater was the preferred distance of the Holocaust. Our last study aimed to investigate the effect that abstract versus concrete representations have on the respective group, meaning that we investigated whether the perpetrator group shows a more positive attitude or a higher willingness to reconcile towards the victim group when the victim group used abstract representations in an intergroup dialogue. On the victim side, we expected them to show a more positive attitude or a higher willingness to reconcile when the perpetrators used concrete representations. This could both be confirmed in the third study, and again the effect was strongest in the Holocaust context, weaker in the neutral context, but this time reversed in the Rwandan genocide context. Additionally, we could show that Germans feel indeed more morally accepted by Jews who chose abstract representations, whereas Jews feel more empowered by Germans who chose concrete representations. And the more they felt empowered, the higher was their positive attitude or their willingness to reconcile. So practically, this project and these findings can contribute to planning, designing, and structuring of memorials, monuments, museums, interventions, education, and so on. And future research should extend the generalizability in different social contexts and different victim-perpetrator dyads. Also, a more thorough investigation of the translation of the group's needs into preferences is for sure needed at this point. So thank you for your attention, and I hope it was somehow understandable in this short amount of time, but you can of course contact me for any questions.